So, just a quick heads up on a couple of things. General questions about research. Sounds like people are continuing to move forward, get research credits knocked out of the way. That's awesome. You guys are doing a great job there. A lot of questions about whether or not where things are at in terms of being credited. Sometimes it takes investigators, researchers a little bit of time to go through and credit the studies that you've gone through and participated in. So if you have any questions about when a study is going to be credited, go through, get in touch with whoever the contact person is on that study, ask them, just say, hey, I was just wondering when I might sort of anticipate credits coming up. They'll be able to tell you. Sometimes they kind of do it in batches. But if it's been a while and you haven't had any sort of return, let me know, say, hey, sort of this is going on, I can try and track that down. But always sort of the person who's listed on the study, be a good first person to reach out and get in touch with. Okay. Other thing to be thinking about is we have quiz 6 will be on Wednesday, so that'll be the last quiz that you can drop, and then we'll go roll into quiz 7, and so we're getting really close to the end. Gonna have SI session tonight. Is that correct, Samantha?
Yep, we'll have it tonight. Our regular time is 6:30.
Oh, we can't hear you. I can't hear you.
I can hear.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, maybe. Okay. You know what's going on? Cripes. All right. Hold on real quick. Samantha, you tell folks about whatever we're going to be telling people. I got to go through and run. Yeah, I'll be right back. I got to get a set of headphones real quick. Okay.
Okay, I sent a chat, but yeah, we'll have SI tonight at 6:30 like usual. So, I'll see you guys then.
What are the hostage takers doing with Dr. Clapp?
All right.
You sure you want to know that, man?
All right. Look at this. Now I have headphones on. I'm cool like Cade. Except it sounds like I'm talking to you all from down at the bottom of a pool, but that's all right. We'll deal. So how about this? This sounds better to me. Can someone talk to me real quick?
Hey, Dr. Clapp.
Talking right now.
Okay, there we go. Now we got it. All right. Yeah, I just felt like I was a submarine with both of them on there. So, okay. So, got this. I think we're set up. Samantha, you gave everybody a heads up on SI. Got that? Okay, cool. Thank you. Sorry for accusing you of not being able to hear. Everybody could. It was just me. We'll do our review session tomorrow evening. Have at 5, I'll send out an announcement. We'll have our last quiz on Wednesday, and then we'll be doing clinical psych stuff through the end. Now, I don't know that we'll get all the way through our last set of lecture slides today. We probably won't. But still make sure that you go through and read the assigned modules because it's possible we'll have text questions coming from that. But if we didn't cover it in lecture, in terms of lecture material stuff, don't worry about that material for lecture questions and things like that. We'll just sort of get to wherever we get with this. Does that sound all right? Okay. So, let's see if I can configure this in a way that makes sense with things. All right. We'll do this. And Okay. I think that should be pretty good. All right. So we finished last time talking about social conformity, talked about social facilitation, group polarization, groupthink. And again, the take-home message here with all of this research is showing how, when we're around other people, what a powerful influence it is, just other people being around, particularly if those people are similar to us in terms of their thinking, if different people have different levels of power and things like that. All of this social context has a massive, massive impact on how we go through and behave. Okay, and one of the in the 50s and 60s, okay, we had just recently come out of World War II, right? And when it became when word of German atrocities and medical experiments and concentration camps and things like that came out, the question was, how could people do this? You've got an entire country, well, maybe not an entire country, but sort of people who were just should be normal people, right? Who seem to be complicit in some of the most horrendous atrocities that sort of modern world has ever seen. And there was a lot of interest in psychology about what are the influences, what could drive people to engage in these types of behaviors. And so started to get into a lot of research looking at conformity and social pressures and things along those lines. And some classic research on conformity was exciting, or sort of interesting in sort of how simple it was in terms of looking at sort of small things that people will do just to go along with a group. Okay, and so this some research conducted by a gentleman named Solomon Asch, and Solomon Asch had a pretty straightforward experiment. All Asch did was get groups of people, 7 to 9 people together, and ask them to judge the length of a series of lines. Okay, pretty straightforward. Task is easy. All you need to do is go through and tell me A, B, or C, which one of those lines is as long as X. Okay, Cade, what's the right answer?
B.
B, right? Was that a hard task? Was that a confusing task? Did you have to think about that a whole lot? If I had to ask you how confident you were that B is the correct answer, what would you say in terms of percentage confidence?
90%.
90%. Seems low to me. I think you're being yourself. I would give myself 100% on that, right? So this is a very, very specific task. It's a very, very easy task. But what Asch did was get people together, again, 7 to 9 groups, and just had them go through and sort of rate sort of length of lines. But the trick is in these experiments, everybody in that group of 7 to 9, all of them were Confederates except for one. In that group of 7 to 9 individuals, there was only one actual participant. Everyone else was in on the study. Okay, and what they did is they found, depending on the types of answers other people gave, all of a sudden people starting to go through and change their ratings in terms of which line. So basically, if we go through and have individuals come in and say, which one of these lines is sort of the equal to X, about 100% accuracy. People almost always get this right. But Kate, if I put you in a group, right, with, and I'm just looking at people, I'm a Jared, Kaya, Jonathan, Kylie, Hannah, Jacob, and they're all in on it. And one after another, right, they say C, and the next one says C, and the next one says C, and the next one says C. By the time we get around to you, Cade, what are you likely to say?
I'm likely to say C as well.
Yeah, and why is that?
Because that's what the group thinks, and I should think like what the group thinks.
Exactly. Okay, and so what we see as people starting to go through and do this over, again, they did this over 12 trials, and what they found is when everybody else in the group is giving the wrong answer, over 80% of participants reported an incorrect answer at least once over the 12 trials. Okay, and we saw large individual differences in this study. Some people never conformed. Some people let's say, Jonathan, you're in there, and you always give the correct answer, even though, or the answer that you believe to be correct, even though everybody else in the group has given a different answer. There were some of those folks in there, but those folks were few and far between, and they're also reported giving the correct answer that they knew to be true with a great deal of discomfort. Okay. Other people just conformed across the board, just always gave the same answer as what other people did. But again, on 80% of the trials, at least one time over the course of over the course of 12 trials, 80% of participants at least one time gave an answer that they presumably knew to be incorrect, just because everybody else in the group had said so. Okay, and so this is a small, very simple thing, right? But shocking that even in an obvious task like this, how powerful social conformity is, because these aren't people who they knew. They're not friends. They're not anybody who has any impact on your standing. But still, the conformity of saying A is the correct answer because everybody else has said it, sort of going through and again looking at the strong social pressure to conform, not being the person who's sort of deviating from the rest of the group. Okay. And again, what they found, they did a lot of these different studies. Okay, they did a lot of different iterations, changing the size of the group, how many people sort of said the wrong answer before, sort of all sorts of different things. And so within Ash's research, some things that they found that increase conformity, 3 or more individuals. Okay, if it's just Madison and I, okay, and we're judging the lengths of lines, and Madison gives the wrong answer, I'm going to look at Madison, I'm like, I don't know what you're looking at, but it's this one, right? People rarely deviate if it's just 2 people, but as soon as we get 3 or more individuals, so Jacob says C, and Madison says C, the likelihood of me saying C increases considerably, okay? And then as that group gets larger and larger, it gets more difficult for me to go against the group consensus. If everybody else outside of myself all agrees and says the answer is C, that starts to increase my likelihood of saying C as well. If one other person, if Daniel's in my group and Daniel says, no, it's B, the likelihood of me going through and saying B and giving the correct answer shoots way up. But if everybody else across the board gives the wrong answer, for me to deviate, it starts to become very difficult. If I'm in a group who has status or am with a group of people who are attractive, the likelihood of me going through and giving the correct answer starts to go down because presumably if I give the incorrect answer, then I'm deviating from the group and risking jeopardizing my stance with the group. So we see we see conformity increase with the status and attractiveness of a group if I'm not committed to any other response. Okay, so if I say, Brooke, tell me which one of these lines is the right answer. And you say, oh, it's this answer. And then I go through and have everybody go through and then ask you again what your answer is. You're more likely to stick with your answer and not deviate. But if I've never actually if I'm not committed to an answer before it gets to me, much more likely to conform and go up. If we do it secret ballot, if no one knows, right? If I have you go through and write everything down, you're probably not going to deviate, or you're not going to fall into line nearly as much as if it's secret ballot, versus if we one by one have to publicly state our answer. Conformity increases by a great deal. If I go through, Lindsay, and before we do this task, I make you feel insecure and incompetent. I do something that makes you feel like question yourself. It makes you feel like maybe you don't have all the right answers or makes you feel bad in some way. We'll see that priming of insecurity will increase conformity. Also, if I'm in a group where cooperation is important, right? If I'm in a group of individuals and we are like, oh, everybody does their own thing and we all have disagreements and that's fine, conformity goes down. But if I'm part of a social group or a culture where conformity is important, the likelihood of me deviating from the rest of the group starts to go down considerably. Okay, so again, as we're going through, again, a very, very simple and straightforward study, but really shocking in the extent to which even for something trivial, who cares if I say The line, I think, is the same as the other one, is obviously different than everybody else, but still a lot of conformity that can be influenced very strongly by a number of different contextual factors. Yeah. And when you ask people about why they conformed, right? So Hannah, you say it's C after everybody else said C, and I say, Hannah, it's B. It's obviously B. Like, why did you say C, right? People rarely say other people back, oh, well, I thought it actually looked like it. I mean, the justification of sort of why I did it, right? People often won't say, oh, I just did it because everybody else did it, right? What we see is distortions of judgment. I assume I'm wrong. Like, everybody else just gaslighted me. I'm assuming that I'm seeing something wrong. And so I literally think the answer is C because everybody else said it's C. And so it's questioning my own judgment, sort of convincing myself that C is the actual answer, but not as much as you would say. It's very obvious that everybody else said C, and that's why I said C. But generally, that's not the number one reason that people will give in these studies when they went through and gave the incorrect response. Okay. So questions about Ash's conformity research here?
Someone in the chat asked if social conformity was a large factor in presidential elections.
Could be. Although, and thank you, Kate, and anybody else. I don't, because sometimes people would send me questions, sort of that's not to the group, and so I didn't want to have my chat on my screen while that's going. So if someone's asking questions, sort of let me know. Conformity could be an issue with presidential elections, right? Something that came up. But what's the one thing that might cut down on conformity in terms of when people are actually casting their votes?
The anonymity of voting itself.
Exactly, right? When I go in to vote, right, I'm the only one who knows my vote, right? And so if we're looking at this here, right, behavior will be known by other group members. I can tell people I voted for whoever I want. No one's ever going to know, right? So if I'm able to do that privately, that decreases my likelihood of conformity. But when we're talking with people who are around us, like, oh, who did you vote for, things along those lines, that social conformity starts to be a huge impact, right? If I have a bunch of friends who I know are all Biden supporters, or a bunch of friends who are all Trump supporters, the likelihood of me sort of being candid about my voting choices starts to decrease if whatever my choice is goes against the group. Yeah. So for this, independent ballot or secret ballot starts to become very important. All right. So maybe you say to yourself, well, that's fine. That's just lines. That's not a big deal. Who cares about lines? If I choose the wrong line, it impacts anybody else zero on this, right? But when we start to go in and start to look at some early research on obedience, I think the Ash stuff is surprising on its own. When we get into obedience, we get stuff that is truly shocking. No one else. I can't see if anybody else thinks it's a bad pun. Get into some Milgram experiments, okay? And so again, what Milgram was interested is if you're told to do something, okay? So what are the limits on obedience, okay? And now all of a sudden we have something that looks a little bit more high stakes. So what Milgram did is recruited people for what Milgram described as a learning study, okay? And so this is just people from the community. This isn't undergrads. This is just folks coming in from out off the street. Recruited people from the community come in and be either randomized to be either teachers or learners in this learning study. And so what they did is they brought folks in and sort of did a random draw to determine whether or not these pairs of folks were going to be the teacher or the learner. Well, the random draw was rigged. The actual participant, one of the people in there in the pair, was always part of the study, and the participant, the person off the street, also always ended up being the teacher. So they put the teacher in and set him in front of a panel, an old-timey, scary-looking panel that looks like this one we've got displayed here. And what they did is they took the learner and put the learner in a separate room where they couldn't be seen by the teacher. But what they did is there was an open intercom, so you could communicate back and forth. And what they did is they went through and gave sort of the teacher gave a pair of items and that the learner was supposed to match. But the thing is if they got the incorrect answer, what they would do was supposed to give the learner a shock in the other room. Okay, and as they go through and take a look at this, at first for initial errors, shocks were low. What they had on this panel is shocks ranging from 15 volts on the low end to 450 volts on the high end at 15 volt intervals. At the low end, we have shocks rated as on the board as slight or moderate. At the upper end, it has things like extreme shock, danger, severe shock, and then just XXXX. Okay, and what they did is every time the learner made a mistake, they would go through and deliver a shock in increasing levels. Okay, but at the low end, at like 75 volts, the learner, who again was a Confederate in the other room, starts to make some noise. Like, ouch, ouch, right? At 120 volts, the learner begins to complain. At 150 volts, learner demands to be released. Screams of agony at 285 volts. And again, this goes up to 450 volts. Okay, and so they're going through increasing, and these are just people off the street. And when the participant would express concern for the person in the other room, the experimenter, who is just a person in a white lab coat, would just say the experiment requires you to come to continue. They say, well, what about that other person? What about that other person over there? They're like, well, that other person is my responsibility. The experimenter requires you to go on. Okay, so that was the study, and sort of what they did is, they had gone through, and Milgram went through and surveyed students, faculty, psychiatrists, community members on predictions, like how far did people think that folks would continue on the shock. And the people that Milgram surveyed say, hey, this is what I'm doing. How far do you think people would go? People uniformly suggested or thought that participants would discontinue once the shocks became painful to the person in the other room. Psychiatrists thought that most people wouldn't exceed 150 volts. No more than 5% would exceed 300 volts, and only 1 in 1,000 would proceed to the full 450 volts. Okay. And as we go through, up here, I don't think this is in your slide. There's a YouTube thing. I don't know that YouTube will play, or so you'll be able to catch it in our sort of video thing. I'll send you the link. Do go through and watch this clip. It's incredibly interesting, pretty disturbing, kind of sad, because what they found in this study was that 60% of participants, and this is just folks coming off the street, this is you and me, our moms and dads, our neighbors, people in our community coming through, and 60% of people went through and proceeded to hit the full 450 volts, even after the person is screaming in the other end, or the person is supposedly screaming, and then they go silent over there, continuing to administer shocks. Okay? And this was pretty upsetting to folks, because this is a situation where people were just coming into a study, right? And it's supposed to be a study about learning and behavior. There's nothing objectively keeping that person continuing to administer shocks, right? All it is someone like me in a coat telling you that the experiment must go on. You could say, well, why would you do that? Well, what, right? Like, I'm going to get up and I'm going to leave. And some people did, but the majority of people didn't, right? And what we see in terms of explaining this, right, is what we call some foot in the door phenomenon. Foot in the door phenomenon refers to my willingness to start to agree to small requests that go through and start to build larger and larger and larger and larger requests, right? So if I'm a salesperson, right, and I go knock on your door, right, and I wouldn't right now because it's the middle of COVID, but let's say, Colin, I knock on your door and I say, hey, Colin, I got this thing that I'm trying to sell. It's a really super good product. Can I tell you a little bit about it, right? What are you likely to say there?
Well, I mean, normally I would tell people no, but for the sake of this, sure.
Okay, so you say sure. So maybe you don't even have a high level of sort of me sort of want. But what if I say, can I tell you a little bit about this? Or, hey, I've got this thing that's going to cost you $5,000, this vacuum that's going to cost you $5,000. Which one of those things are you more likely to agree to?
I would more likely agree to just hearing.
Just hearing
what you
about
have
it,
to say.
right? And so what we do is I start there. But if I'm a good salesman, I start just sort of increasing the request a little bit by a little bit by a little bit. And then pretty soon I've sold you a $5,000 vacuum that you didn't want. But you've said yes to all these things up to this point, and so to say no now is very hard because we got this foot in the door technique, and we see this all over the place, right? We see this, it's big in sales, right? But other types of behavior where sometimes of abusive behavior in relationships or sexual assault types of things, right? Where like, oh, I'm in a physically abusive relationship. That probably didn't start out on the first date. Someone punched me in the eye and sent me to the hospital, right? It was probably a small set of aggressive acts that continued on, and I just kind of say, okay, I let it slide, and I go, and I go, and I go, until now all of a sudden I'm in an incredibly violent relationship, right? And it's not clear how I got there, but it's this foot in the door technique, right? Now, if we had people come through in the Milgram experiment and say, okay, this person, the first time they get something wrong, I want you to go ahead and throw this 450 volt shock that's labeled XXXX. What are people going to do? They're going to say no, right? But if I start low and I move high, right, we get this foot in the door technique where we start to get to a point where people are engaging behaviors that are pretty extreme. Okay? So just like the ASH studies went through and did a number of these iterations of this, and so looking at things that start to impact obedience. The prestige of the authority figure starts to become important, right? If I'm trying to do this with you all, I could probably get you to shock some folks, right? But who cares about me? I'm just some random professor in the psychology department, right? But if it were someone who you saw to be an authority figure and a very prestigious authority figure, the likelihood of you moving forward and continuing on with shock starts to get increasingly likely. So if it's, say, the governor, right, of Wyoming. I don't know if anybody cares about the governor of Wyoming, but that's certainly someone who has more prestige than me, right? And if you knew that it was governor and the governor was telling you to go through and do things, you would start to, the likelihood of you increasingly being obedient and sort of moving forward starts to increase. We also see the proximity of the authoritative figure starts to become important. In these studies, when Milgram would do this, when the experimenter was then in another room, or the researcher was in another room, and sort of saying, hey, the experiment must continue, less likelihood of people moving forward than if I'm sitting right there, standing right next to you, over your shoulders, telling you the experiment must continue, the experiment requires you to go on. Proximity starts to become important. I also see depersonalization of the victim, or whoever's of the learner in this case, right? If this is just some random person who I don't know anything about, they're just participant B, it's much easier for me to go through and administer shocks than if I know this person's background, their history. If I'm familiar with this person, much less likely for me to move forward with stuff. Okay. We also see that obedience drops if we have other people who are refusing to participate. And we see this all the time. Okay. If there are no role models for defiance, if everybody else is just going along and doing the same thing and no one deviates, it's very, very hard for me not to obey and continue on. But if I've got even one example of someone who says, no, I'm not going to do this, it's like a switch. It breaks. And now, yeah, I'm not going to do this either, right? But to be the first one who goes through to say, oh, no, I'm not going to continue. I'm not going to continue shocking this person. In the absence of that, it's very hard for me to be the person who skips out of this. Okay. So, again, usually what we would do is we would go through and sort of watch the film clip and sort of a couple minutes of that, and to kind of give you a real sense for what's going on. Watch this. I'll send you the link. Make sure to watch it. But questions about Milgram and some of this obedience stuff that Milgram was doing?
I have a question kind of about, I guess, the name of like an experiment.
Yeah.
But, like, is there a name for an experiment when it's like you tell people there's one experiment, but there's actually something else going on? Like, is there a name for that?
Yeah, it's called deception. Sort of basic. I mean, so,
Okay.
and Colin, this is not a. You couldn't do this experiment today. Like Ash, you could do. Milgram, you couldn't do, right? Because basically what you've done in order for this experiment to work, I have to allow you to think that you could be actually doing fatal damage to someone in another room, right? Now, interestingly, when they went through, and they obviously debriefed everyone after this to say, hey, so this was the thing, this is why we're doing it. And at least based on records or sort of what people have said is that people generally at the time did not respond, like people generally thought that it was an interesting question and didn't respond negatively to this, but yeah, the level of deception that would be required to conduct this study is probably not something that we would allow someone to ethically do right now. But so, yeah, again, this was being done before we had strong IRBs and regulations on what people could do. And this is a good thing. We need to put some constraints on folks, but some interesting stuff that came out of here.
So does personality play into this also? Because, like, there has to be, if you have the absence of role models or you have role models for defiance, there has to be a first person.
Yeah.
So does that mean that personality has kind of a little bit of a role in it too? Like, just saying you can't tell me that I have to stay here and leaving anyway?
Potentially, Kylie. And in terms of those big 5 traits, I would think maybe agreeableness, which is kind of weird to think that the more agreeable people would be the folks who would go on and continue to deliver what they perceive to be potentially fatal shocks to somebody else. But I could see someone higher in agreeableness not wanting to sort of cause conflict or something like that if I'm saying, oh, no, I'm not going to do this. But my guess is that personality probably impacts this very, very little, right? And again, if you think about sort of the cultural historical context when this was taking place, again, thinking about people in Germany in the late 30s, early 40s, right, during World War II, like the idea that you have a homogenous group of Germans who all have the same personality and are all carrying out some of these pretty atrocious acts is probably not accurate. You probably have people with varying different types of personalities, right? But just looking at the social pressures to say, oh, I would never do such a thing, well, our data suggests that you probably would, right? Maybe not, but probably, if I had to guess, my guess is that you would, given sufficient pressure. Not you specifically, Kylie. I think you would be the brave one to stand up. But just in terms of human stuff, right? It's uncomfortable, the level, sort of how easy it is to set up a situation where people will go through and engage in things that I would presume are inconsistent with their beliefs. Other questions about Milgram? Okay. Go through, make sure that you go through and watch sort of the video clip, and I'll send it to you. It's very interesting to see actual footage of sort of the experiment and some of the stuff that's going on in people's reactions. Okay. So, Milgram stuff come out, and another question that started to come up is sort of this interest in the adoption of certain roles. Okay, so again, in sort of combat situations or correctional sort of prison types of situations or other situations where people are required or asked to take on some sort of formal role, some official role, and looking at the impact of me engaged in an assigned role and the impact of that on behavior. And so a gentleman named Philip Zimbardo started to become interested in the types of influences on prison behavior, right? So you've got these prisons, and you've got prison guards, prison staff with a lot of power, and then you've got inmates with very, very little power, and some of the dynamic to see some of the stuff that goes on in correctional facilities, sort of what's going on and some of the influences there. And so what Zimbardo did is he recruited students, and these were university students at Stanford. And this was in 75, right? And so he was paying them $15 a day to participate in this study, where they're either going to be randomly assigned to be prisoners or guards. Okay, and $15 a day in 75, that was a decent chunk of change, right? So you got people coming in wanting to participate in this. And so what they did is they went through, screened participants for physical, psychological health on the front end. And once they went through, brought them in, randomized them to be either prisoners or guards, and then what they did is they put them on a 24-hour participation. Prisoners, so they built a mock prison in the basement of a Stanford building, right? Prisoners, people who got assigned to be a prisoner, were arrested at their homes and imprisoned by guards in this mock prison. Prisoners were there in their cells for 24 hours a day. Guards were working on 8-hour shifts. Okay, prisoners had sort of prison jumpsuits. Guards had uniforms, shaded glasses, a bunch of stuff, and just tried to make it sort of set up like an actual sort of prison system. And the experiment was scheduled to continue for 14 days. It was discontinued after 6. Okay, what they found were the students who were assigned to the guard role started becoming increasingly abusive to the student prisoners, and engaging in more and more sort of cruel and kind of sadistic behaviors towards the people who were playing prisoners. Student prisoners started becoming pretty despondent and sort of started to have some anxiety attacks and started to become pretty emotionally volatile. And again, we won't sort of normally we would go through and watch the clip. I'll send you this link here. But important to go through and watch this, because what they do is they go through and actually interview. They have footage from the experiment, and they have people who were students who were guards and students who were prisoners, and went through and interviewed them to say, hey, what was this experience like? And yeah, it's a pretty intense thing, right? They discontinued the experiment after 6 days. They should have discontinued that far earlier. Again, this was all pre-IRB. Like, you can't do this anymore. But the types of behaviors saw, and again, there was nothing going on here, right? At any point in time, anybody could have said, nope, I'm done. I'm finished, right? But the behaviors that people were engaged in, again, were pretty upsetting and shocking to see that people, it's play acting, right? At any point in time, right, Kate, if you're in this, you could say, I'm not doing this. This is weird. I'm out, right? But what people don't do, they don't do that, right? So they fall into these roles. And this research started to become kind of the basis for some interest in a phenomenon called de-individuation, okay? And this is what we see if I'm in a situation where my emotions are all charged up, but I'm kind of anonymous. I'm kind of in a part of a big group. I may be dressed like everybody else. It's hard to tell me from Kylie, from Daniel, from Jacob, from Hannah, from Brooke, because we're all kind of in a big mob. We're all kind of the same thing together. What we see is a general loss of awareness and constraint that we would normally do, right? So Brooke, I imagine, Brooke, I don't know you well, but I'm going to guess that you probably aren't into smashing windows with bricks and looting and setting things on fire. Is that correct?
That is true. I do not enjoy those things.
Okay. But if I were to put you in sort of a mob situation where there was a lot of people, where you were really cranked up, really angry, experiencing a lot of intense emotions, right? What we might find is that you get sucked in, because it's not you, it's not Brooke the person going through and doing this. This is this woman in the middle of this mob doing things that you would never do on your own, right? But this de-individuation, if you can't differentiate me from anybody else, sort of psychologically, sort of the constraints on my behavior start to go down, and all of a sudden we see people starting to engage in behaviors that are we wouldn't see on an individual basis and things. And so this is one of the things people will make arguments about, in military, right? So everybody's wearing the same uniform, everybody's doing the same stuff, everybody looks the same way. There's nothing unique or individual about you necessarily relative to the group, which then reduces some constraints in moving forward. Same thing with uniforms for sort of officers, or uniforms for prisoners, and things along these lines, right? This de-individuation, if I'm in a group of people and I'm just one in the number, what we start to see is some potentially reckless or dangerous behaviors. The likelihood of that starting to increase. And so again, go through and watch this clip, and I'll send this out to you. It's pretty intense in some spots, and again, this is not research that we would ever try to do today, but I think interesting to see that without too much pressure, if I get the right social situation, sort of the likelihood of some pretty shocking behavior starts to increase quite a bit. Questions about Zimbardo?
I do have a question not related to Zimbardo.
Okay.
Are you recording this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What?
Okay, I was just checking to make sure.
Why's that?
I didn't see the recording icon anywhere.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, I've got it recording through a different program. So thank you, Cade, for the heads up. At this point, with 8 minutes left, it would have been no good anyway. But thank you. Yes, because I forget about that stuff sometimes. But yeah, we got this recorded. Yeah. Other questions? Feeling okay with this? I don't know, sort of the sad facets of behavior of your fellow man.
I'll hold it till later once we get to the general question.
Okay. All right. So, again, usually we would talk about this before we get into prejudice and stuff like that, but thinking about how we, again, start to understand some of these behaviors that we see are real because they happen, right? But the types of things that go through. And again, my fundamental attribution error, if I'm looking at people who are involved in cults and sort of committing mass suicide, or individuals who are engaging in physical, psychological, sexual abuse, torture, homicide, right? Or people who are in, fraternities, sororities, other groups, and hazing stuff starts to go wrong. And it's easy to say, oh, well, those people are deviants. They're morally weak. Those people are followers. Those people are bad people because they engaged in those situations. And I would say, yeah, that behavior is definitely, there's no arguing that behavior is not good. But I think it's naive to underestimate the types of social and situational things that can go through and start to influence behaviors. And this isn't to excuse the behavior. This isn't to say, oh, well, it's fine. Like sometimes, like, if I get caught up in a group and we engage in a little murder, well, that's just kind of the situation. That's not what I'm saying. But when we're going through and we're taking a look at sort of some of the stuff that happens, right, recognizing how strong of an influence social pressures are, we are social creatures. We don't like to be not part of the group. We don't like to be the people who deviate from other folks. In general, if I put together the right social pressures, I can start to motivate a lot of behavior that individually, if I ask that person, hey, do you want to do this? They would say, no, thank you. That's terrible. But if we get the right situations, people will we can start to shift behavior one way or another. Okay, did you have a question about this stuff here?
Yeah, I had a question about obedience.
Yeah.
So people who are considered disobedient, who don't normally follow what the group follows,
Mm-hmm.
Is there any type of factor behind disobedience?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things. Sensitivity to punishment, right, is one thing, right? We start to see, sort of, for most of us probably, if I do something and my hand gets slapped, I'm probably not going to do it again, or I'm less likely to do it again. Some people just less responsive to that, right? If I'm say, out and I'm single and looking for dates, right? For some of us, if you go out and say, "Oh, hey, how's it going? Can I get your number? Would you like to go out on a date?" and that person says no, that's a devastating thing, right? And so I'm like, "Oh, I'm not going to ever do that again." Some people, I'll just keep asking and asking and asking and asking until someone says yes, and then I'm like, "Sweet," right? So we've got sort of different sort of levels, individual differences in terms of sensitivity to sort of punishment and negative stuff. That starts to get into some neuroticism and some cool, interesting stuff in terms of neural pathways and things along those lines. And there are some individuals who, if you get into things like sociopathy and things like that, who just seem to not really care all that much, right? Some antisocial personality disorder and things along those lines. But in general, even among those of us who say, "Oh, this person's a nonconformist," or "this person does what they want," or "this person doesn't care what other people think," maybe to an extent, but probably still yes, right? Like if I truly didn't care what anybody else thought, if I was truly independent, you start to get into stuff that looks like anarchy, right? Like, so maybe I drive on the wrong side of the road, or I refuse to use money, or I don't wear pants, something like, I don't know. Like, so if you think about all the stuff in our day-to-day life, right, that just still conforms, right? Even within subgroups of folks, you're like, oh, we're sort of, you think like classically, I don't know, this is getting old and stuff, like punk rock, right? Like, oh, we're against the system, we're against sort of this stuff. But if you look at folks who sort of are part of that scene, they all look pretty similar because they're all kind of doing the same stuff. So we still have conformity even when we're nonconformists in a lot of ways, right? Which is a good thing for society, because if we were truly all doing our own thing, it'd be mass chaos, right? But recognizing that for the most of us, for us to sort of go against a value, particularly if it's a valued group norm, it's a very difficult thing to do.
Dr. Clapp, does this contribute, or is this connected to in-group bias and things like that?
Yeah. So again, if Zimbardo was part of my in-group, or if Milgram was part of my in-group, right? If I was familiar with Milgram's research, and I'm a big Milgram fan, right? Like let's say I'm a Milgram fanboy. I'm like, yeah, this guy is cool, and everybody else, I want to be part of his stuff, right? The likelihood of me going through and complying with instructions to go through and shock are going to be sort of much higher. If it's a member of an outgroup, or if it's someone who I don't value or respect, right, the likelihood of me moving forward is probably less likely. And so, again, with some of these questions, what's going on here? It's sort of a number of things mixing together, right? So we got issues with compliance and obedience, right? And so now if we look at the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, right? Like there's sort of me, if I'm part of the unit, right, and sort of valuing the acceptance of people in my unit, and the people who we have as prisoners are part of a cultural outgroup, and not only just an outgroup, they're an enemy, and now all of a sudden we throw in danger where there really I could be killed by sort of members of this group versus this group. We just start layering on different things until it would be shocking if some of this stuff didn't happen, right? And so we see all of this stuff sort of coming together, and this is the dark version of social psychology. That there's other stuff that we aren't going to get to about sort of helping other people, which is an important thing, a very important thing. But sort of understanding we don't live in a we don't exist in a vacuum. Our behavior is constantly influenced by those around us and expectations in society and things like that. So all of these things, the groupthink, the de-individuation, the obedience, the conformity, all that stuff starts to make it very, very difficult, right? So we will generally kind of rarefy those people who are sort of who go against the grain, who sort of stand up for what's right and things like that, and reasonably so, because it's a very, very difficult thing to do, right? Just because of all these pressures. But again, thinking back to when we started on this, that fundamental attribution error, where I'm judging other people's behavior based on sort of their internal characteristics, the external stuff, the social stuff, the environmental, the situational stuff, is probably the driver of most of the stuff that goes on. Good questions. Other stuff.
Is there a point to where people just disobey with someone because they don't like them?
Oh, sure. You see, so again, my wife is a school psychologist, right? And so you've got kids. You probably think back to sort of your school age stuff, or people you might know now, sort of some struggles with conduct disorder, or oppositional defiant disorder. Like, yeah, I'm just gonna, for one reason or another, being on the other side of stuff is just reinforcing for me. If I can contradict you, Colin, even if I kind of agree with you, if I can come forward with a counterpoint or an argument against you, for whatever reason, that's just something that I'll drift to. So there definitely are folks out there who are like that, but it's not the norm, right? You see some folks, and so even if I'm sort of, and it sort of differs, right? If I'm kind of stubborn and hard-headed, I'm going to think what I'm going to think. Sort of maybe if I'm that type of person, maybe less likely to go through and engage. But if, again, sort of as we were talking with Maya, I start to raise the stakes, right? If this isn't just like, oh, our opinions, right? Just hanging out. If it starts to become, if it's status or sort of life and death stuff starts to come up, it's the likelihood of me. And so again, thinking about again, Nazi Germany, right? So you have people in the concentration camps and conducting stuff that, terrible war crimes, right? But if I'm a sort of an officer and I'm like, oh, hey, I'm not going to do that. Well, I've seen what these people will do to sort of folks who they don't like, right? So for me to step up and say, oh, hey, you guys are garbage, I'm not going to do this anymore, starts to become hard, right? And again, none of this is to say, oh, this excuses the behavior. Oh, guess it was fine to do that. But it just starting to recognize the social pressures that we're all susceptible to. But luckily, most of us aren't in our day lives being encouraged to give someone violent and potentially lethal shocks. Fortunately. All right. Any other questions on stuff? And again, we're past time, so if you need to split, sort of go through and take off. Again, we're going to have a quiz on Wednesday, same thing as before. SI session tonight, review session tomorrow, and we'll just carry forward with stuff. But this is super interesting stuff. If anybody has questions, I'll stay on and field stuff.
Is module 37 going to be on the quiz still?
Yeah, Colin, it's on the syllabus, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, go through, read it, make sure that you kind of know. There could be text questions that get pulled from there, but don't worry about the set of slides for the lecture stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Already took textbook.
Cool. Anything else?
So when you mentioned, just kind of curious.
Yeah.
When you mentioned sociopathy and just other types of diseases when it comes to disorders, would sociopathy be one of those disorders where it affects disobedience?
Yeah. So we get into an interesting. If I'm looking at, so sociopathy or psychopathy isn't a disorder, isn't it like it's a trait, right? So if I say someone's a sociopath, that's not actually, like, as a clinical psychologist, I can't diagnose someone as a sociopath because that's not a disorder. I can say this person has, and if I'm looking from a sociology perspective, you say sociopaths, psychopathy, psychopath is sort of what kind of goes on. We've got conditions or diagnoses that are related to antisocial personality disorder. So you see things early on in the lifespan, things like callous, unemotional types of behaviors, cruelty to animals, defiance of rules, law breaking, and things along those lines that gets into, and this isn't an area I work in, but the idea is that some set of individuals with antisocial personality disorder would be high on psychopathy, which looks more like sort of, it's like a subset, it's kind of a different thing, sort of this cold, unemotional, kind of callous sort of type of thing. But you also see kids, the oppositional defiant disorder is a diagnosis, right? So these are kids who, like, if you say do this, they're going to do that, right? And that can cause some problems. Conduct disorder starts to become, it's not just I'm defiant, I'm actually engaging in antisocial types of behaviors and things along those lines, right? So psychopathy or sociopathy, some people who study this, it's kind of a more specific subset of things, which isn't necessarily associated with like serial murder and things like that, right? So the idea is that some people who are sort of CEOs or doctors or things like that just high in sociopathy just because I don't have much there in terms of sort of I make decisions and sort of so it's an interesting area, but a little bit different than some of the diagnostic stuff that we would do in terms of giving people diagnoses. Did that kind of help to or muddy the waters sufficiently? Okay, cool. Other questions? Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks for hanging out through my hostage video. Hopefully these guys are done with my roof by the time we sort of kick back in on Friday. But let me know if you have any questions, and hopefully see everybody at review session on Tuesday. So we'll see ya.
Thank you.
Yep.
See ya. Thank you.